it's like stacking yourself up for imposter syndrome. I mean, to me, it's like, I'll take a giant order of imposter syndrome, please,
Right,
because
exactly.
like I'm claiming something that I know isn't true. Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I am much more awake this week. So
Yes, I noticed that.
So yay.
Yay.
So next week is our 100th episode. So please do continue to send in any thoughts you have about how you have in business or in life like to celebrate your milestones and big achievements. We're going to be including those, as well as we're probably going to be doing a segment where we have a nice little collection of feedback that people have sent, thoughts. A lot of people say they sort of talk to us as we're talking. And so we're collecting some of those. We're going to start this new segment at the end where we hear from our listeners. So you can do that by text, phone, or email. Emails talk to us at sohere'smystory.com. If you write, we will read it for you. Or if you want to actually leave us a voicemail, we can use that at 410-205-6055. And you can also text that number. So
Okay. Yay. So what we're going to get into in a minute is Jody's story, but really, as she says at the beginning, it's our story.
It's our story. It's like a story within a story.
It is, which is why I love it. And what we talk about when we come out of this is kind of a subtle difference that makes a huge difference in the end about, are you cheating or are you being smart about certain strategies you can employ in your business and in your various endeavors. And this is a conversation that I'm so glad we had because it's been on my mind a number of times. So
gaming the system.
Gaming the system.
Versus side doors.
Yep. So you ready to go?
Off we go. So here's my story, although it's actually sort of our story, but I haven't told it to you yet. Knock it off. So as you know, as I think our listeners know, this is our 99th episode. I know. And so next week is our 100th episode, which feels like a really big deal.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing some research and reading about how we can make the most out of that. I mean, we know what we're going to do with the episode, I think, or most of it. I have some other ideas I haven't told you yet, but also just how do we increase visibility? What are our options? What should we be thinking of? And so I had this conversation with, a podcast consultant agency person yesterday that I know, and just bouncing off some ideas of how do we make the most of this thing we have? You know, what can I do with it? Because I'd hate to think of those things like a month from now. And it's so interesting because I liked his idea, which I'll tell you about in just a second. Okay. But I had this like a serious internal reaction to it. And I think this is an interesting venue through which to discuss it. So he was basically saying that for things like 100th episode, you can essentially treat it almost like a launch and the same kind of launch strategies you would for a podcast or a show or whatever. Sure. And that included a bunch of kind of spiking things like spiking subscribers or spiking listeners by, you know, a lot of it felt very much like what has now become a standard model when you have a book coming out where you engage all your friends in this launch team.
So you can become an Amazon bestseller.
Yeah, exactly. And that is precisely the tone of voice. I was like, oh, God.
That's the cringy,
Because there's something cringeworthy about it.
There is,
where, and I want to, and yet I don't think it's a bad idea and so what I'm trying to decide is, do I not think it's a bad idea just because it will benefit me? And the show, I don't think so. I think there's something more to it. So I want to pick it apart a little bit because I feel like there's part of it that feels like gross gaming the system. If I reach out to a bunch of people in my network and say, hey, on the 21st, when this episode drops, will you subscribe so it spikes in Apple and then we get this attention and then this happens and whatever. Part of that feels gross to me. And yet,
I agree.
And yet, I mean, in theory, you could tell yourself a story that any kind of marketing or sales or anything is gross, and then you stay quietly hidden in a back room somewhere and no one ever sees your thing.
Well, no, I don't think so. So I don't want to get off track. But to me, what came to mind is, let's say, I've heard variations of this, but I know what I'm going to say, the specific example is wrong. But let's say that I decided that between my mother and my sibling and my best friends, I'm going to give them money so that on the day my book comes out, they buy, pick a number, 10,000 copies of my book. And in that one spurt, I become a New York Times bestseller, right? So then for the rest of my life, I can put on my resume, New York Times bestselling author, even if the book is ridiculous, or whether or not it has nothing to do with merit. It's just because I know that I got people.
See, that's the part that feels
spike it.
Well, two things. One, it feels gross to me. Two, I know me well enough to know that if I did that thing, I would never, ever, ever, ever in my future write down New York Times bestseller because I would
do it.
Well, I know, but I wouldn't make use of it because I would know.
Because you know.
I would know that I
Absolutely.
didn't do the thing, which actually this is really helpful. So maybe this is what feels distinct because it's what we're not, like in this case, let's say it worked and we like shot up in the charts of iTunes or whatever, or wherever we're doing this thing or whatever. And then we get more visibility and people check us out and then the listenership grows. Yeah. That feels good to me. There's no version of that where we would then have some badge I'm putting on things that says, you know, we were the people who did the thing that day. So while the tactic to get there feels a little contrived and orchestrated, it doesn't get me to a point that then I'm saying we were the number one, whatever. Like, and even if we were, I would never use it because it feels.
But no, yucky. but that's the difference because let's say that we used whatever tactic it was and we became visible to a lot of people, and all of a sudden, every episode is being downloaded 20,000 times, right? We have 20,000 downloads per episode. Each of those people would have the absolute discretion to say, I love this. I'm
thanks, but no thanks.
This, or thanks, but no thanks. And they tune out. And so yes, you might have that blip. So you have 20,000 downloads one episode, and the next episode it might go down to 1,000 because on merit they just don't like your podcast.
I'm so glad for this little therapy session because what I'm hearing here, I loved the book 4-Hour Workweek of Tim Ferriss because I liked at the time. I've mentioned this on previous episodes. At the time, I was still a full-time COO. I had started this business on the side. I had tiny toddler children. Like life was tight time-wise, and I actually used some of the concepts of that book. I outsourced some of my actual work at my full-time job so that I would have more time to do other things. Like I loved the concept of outsourcing the right things. So I loved the book, but I had a huge problem with the whole setup of the book in one point where he's talking about, I don't know, it was like jiu-jitsu or Krav Maga. I don't know what it was. Some sort of thing that he became this award winner, something champion.
He could
say, I'm the something champion exclusively because he had found a way to game the rules. And it was so distasteful to me. I don't even remember what it was. It had something to do with that time out of bounds or something. I don't remember. Because I remember thinking, ew, like I would never tell somebody that I was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu champion. If for no other reason, it might get you into a fight where they quickly realize you know nothing about Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but that's not the point. Yeah. It wouldn't feel satisfying for me to say it if I had gotten there through like, gaming the system channels versus if somehow, and I'm trying to think of another example where if doing something, let's go back to the book example. If doing some things to get you in front of other people, to get you a seat at the table or a visibility on the stage where then people can decide for themselves if your thing has merit. Like doing it to gain visibility maybe feels different to me than doing it to gain a title or a reward or a badge of some kind that then you're claiming. Yeah.
Well, and I'll give you an example. So I had decided, this is a number of years ago, I had decided that I had this blog and I really wanted to write for Huffington Post because I thought that would get me a lot more visibility for what I was writing. And at the time, I knew of two ways to become a Huffington Post contributor. One was there was a general solicitation mailbox, which you can submit your blogs and they would theoretically get reviewed and maybe you'd get invited to write. Mm-hmm. The other way was to be invited to write by Arianna Huffington. Mm-hmm. I did not know Arianna Huffington. No, I did not. And I couldn't even get my good friend Oprah to introduce me to Arianna Huffington because she wasn't returning my emails either. So
Yeah.
But I knew that the general mailbox, I knew. I was told that the general mailbox was getting something like 20,000 submissions a day.
Right. Differentiation is impossible at that point.
Right. God himself could not get noticed at 20,000 submissions a day. So what I figured out was I had to get Arianna Huffington to introduce me. Or to invite me. So, what I started to do was I watched on YouTube every single interview and speech and whatever that Arianna Huffington gave. And there was one where she gave the graduates that she was speaking to at commencement, what she said was her personal email address. Write to me with whatever. So I did. I wrote to her. And I thanked her for one of her books at the time. I think it might have been Thrive or something like that. But I had bought the book. I read it. I quoted a section. I said, this meant a lot to me because, and I gave a story from my experience, which actually happened to be part of a blog that I had written, but I didn't say, and here's my blog. I just related it to a story. And 3 days later, she wrote back.
Right. But see, so, okay. I want to make it, but that just feels like hustle to me.
Well, but here's the thing. She wrote back and we corresponded and she did invite me, as she said, I'd like to invite you to contribute your voice to Huffington Post. And so I did write for Huffington Post for a while. My point is that I always laughingly describe that as kind of finding the side door. Not going into the general mailbox, finding the side door, kind of like a little
interesting
loophole, But
Gotcha.
I didn't have a problem with doing that, obviously, because I thought that at that point, once it got to her editor, if I submitted these things and they're like, this is horrible, we can't, I'd be dropped like a bad habit.
Right. Like you still had to stand on your own merit once you get there.
I just got a chance at a bigger spotlight.
I really like that concept of finding a side door. It feels very distinct and it doesn't feel it doesn't feel like it lacks the integrity that I inherently associate with gaming the system. And so it's funny. The reason this feels so important to me is, I'll be honest, I have pretty thoroughly and routinely kind of rolled my eyes at the methodology through which, people, a #1 Amazon bestseller, like anytime someone claims that, somebody may actually be a truly legitimate one. But now I feel like so many people can say it. Then I'm like, yeah, whatever. Yep. So you had a lot of friends do the thing on the day and it made the thing happen.
Or you're in a really obscure niche or something like that.
Well, that's yet another way to game the system. Yeah. Like I've tagged myself as the blah, 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 blah. Yeah. But because I am this I think is even bigger. Like you can take what we're talking about as a metaphor for an even bigger thing. I think sometimes your want to do the right thing and have a lot of integrity and feel the right way can sometimes, not that you can overblow that, but it can keep you from doing the things that are important just to get you where you need to be. And so like this distinction of there is a version of it that is kind of gaming the system, and so that you can say a thing that's a little bit empty and doesn't have it. So my immediate reaction to this suggestion that he made
on the podcast
was, oh my God, no, I'm not doing that. Like I'm not that person. I don't do those things. But I had to pause for a second because I kind of wanted to, because I'm like, but I want the podcast to grow. And so I was having this conflict, and then I was like, wait a minute. Sometimes when you lump things into one bucket and you don't take the time to kind of try to separate them, distinguish the nuances between them, you can, in an effort to do the right thing, accidentally step over perfectly okay things that but of course, then my next thing was like, or are you just rationalizing? So
I think that to me, it's first of all, being true to who you are and not falsely claiming something. So if we were offered the chance, for example, to be on a panel for Fast Company or Forbes or something like that, or to be one of, I'm just making this up, one of Fast Company's podcasts. Okay. But in order to do that, we had to start interviewing people about their latest books, and we had to have a segment on, just devoted to their articles.
That's a hard no.
Because,
and I don't just mean like a hard boundary. I mean, that would be a hard boundary and a difficult no, but it would have to be a no.
It would have to be a no, because that, in order to do that, we would change who we are, what our vision was, what we set out to be. I also think that if you game the system in a way that you're claiming to be something that you're not, whether that's a jiu-jitsu champion.
Well, that's the perfect example.
Yeah, it is. A jiu-jitsu champion, a New York Times best-selling author is it just doesn't feel, and you know it. It just doesn't feel that it's honestly earned.
It's like stacking yourself up for imposter syndrome. I mean, to me, it's like, I'll take a giant order of imposter syndrome, please,
Right,
because
exactly.
like I'm claiming something that I know isn't true.
But I think that so if we did, I don't even know what it is, the strategy, because you've been dancing around. Maybe you'll tell me offline what's the secret. But if we did something and it's our show, we just happen to get more listeners to see, do they like it, do they not? Then I think that's great, because they can decide on their own merits. So we're not claiming to be something we're not.
Well, it's a little bit of a hybrid, though. I mean, it to be fair, the strategy falls a tiny bit between the two, because it's basically saying, reaching out to people that you know and saying, hey, on this date, on the 21st, will you pick up your phone and punch the subscribe button and do this thing? Spike. So that there's a spike. And then that spike then puts you, that spike is the side door that puts you on the stage where, in theory, more people will then see you because you get noticed somewhere or whatever. I mean, it's certainly no guarantee that it works. So the part that is, hey, person I know, will you go hit subscribe? There is some lack of authenticity there, because it may be someone who doesn't even listen to podcasts, never will listen to the podcast. Like, I'm asking them, versus like my friends who already listen to podcasts, either listen or don't listen. Like that's already, that field has already been harvested. This is kind of reaching out to anyone who loves me enough to give me 30 seconds of their time on the 21st to go punch a button. And maybe some of those are subscribed, and maybe those are people who listen randomly but have just never subscribed. So it doesn't, it's notwithstanding people who are legitimate listeners.
So you get that blip, you get that spike, and maybe it gets noticed by the whole thing. I guess it gets noticed.
Well, let's be silly about it. Somebody. Like Apple goes, oh my God, whole listening podcast world, look at this podcast. Right. It doesn't work like that.
Come to the attention of some people, and so you get wider publicity.
In theory.
And if you get that wider publicity, you have more people that have a chance to give a thumbs up or thumbs down.
Here's the fascinating thing. That part of it is not unlike something I have zero issue with, which is, making sure that we're put in front of people who do publish these posts of like 10 best business podcasts to listen to or whatever. That one I have no issue of reaching out to them saying like, hey, take a listen, see what you think. If you think really, include us. I would love to get noticed. That's a great way to like boost what they call discovery. It's making the podcast more discoverable by putting it in places where people will see it. Versus I made the joke about, hiding in some back room somewhere. It doesn't, you can't get to the point where somebody can judge your merit or worthiness of their time if they don't ever see it to try. So it's making it more visible so they can find it.
It's just that first stage of the rocket ship
first part that feels like the thing I do to get the blip to do that. And that's the part that I do struggle with a tiny bit.
But here it is. For me, I think that the only people that would do that would generally be people who think that you have something worthwhile to say or something.
Fair enough.
And you're right. Not all of those people, there might be some people who say, I love Jody. I'm not a podcast person, but I'll click the button right now. And I'm representing myself as, hey, a new subscriber, on the stat sheet, but I'm really not. And you're right. That is, but to your previous point, that would be a big spike. They're not going to show up in our stats going forward. They're not going to show up in our stats going forward. And I distinguish it with the end result. The end result is you're in front of people who are going to judge you on your merits. If the end result were that because of that blip, we got to claim that we were Apple's top 15 business podcast, because on that one day we made it, that would never show up on our social media. We would never do that. To your point, like what we would never do is, let's say that week we had 20 or 30,000 listeners or something. I would never say we have 30,000 listeners a week. Yeah. No, we had 30,000 one that week, but I would never use that badge. So that is a distinction. It still feels a little like I still haven't quite decided if we will do the thing, but I would love, but what I can't ignore is that if I say no to that, then I'm also saying no to something else that I hold really dear, is that I would love for more
people to hear it. So I have, it's like many choices in life. You have to sort of decide which thing is more worth it. And is it, how important is that? But
so I think where I come down from this discussion is I am strongly in favor of using the side door, and I am strongly against gaming the system for, with all of that.
For some kind of claim. I love that distinction. I love that distinction of if you're doing it for a claim that is then inauthentic versus if there are and it depends on what the steps are. They're inauthentic things that I wouldn't do. But to what degree does it feel like the tiniest bit out of step with something you love, to then put you in a bigger field where you can be judged by your merit? Yeah. And feels much better to me.
A lot of times, I think that kind of differentiation is something that I hear a lot of times when people talk about the stories they tell when speaking. Because if you're telling a story in your speech and you want to condense it a little bit, it's not going to be quite the 100% true facts that actually happen, because maybe it's a much longer story. There's a lot more exposition. There are 3 more people involved. Mm-hmm. It's okay. What I was told and what I believe is it's okay if the story you're telling in your speech is not 100% the way it happened, unless you're making the changes to make yourself look better. That all of a sudden you rescued the person, or you stopped this, or you came up with a solution.
That's so interesting. Then so you can delete a month of random activity and say that both things happened on the same day or something, just to make the story more concise.
Correct.
But you can't suddenly become the hero where you were not, or the bad guy. Gotcha.
Exactly. So you can change that. You can change the arc, make the message more pronounced. You can come to the realization sooner, or the events are more dramatic. But if you walk away from the fictionalized version as a different person than you were in real life.
Oh, I love that.
That's kind of the line that I was told about, that was given voice to me by Michael Port. And I agree with that. It rang true to me.
Well, it's interesting because as we've been talking, I've been thinking about ways this applies, beyond issues, well, certainly way beyond the issues of this podcast, but just marketing and business positioning and all those sorts of things. And I was thinking about, if you're applying for a job, I don't consider it a gaming the system to see if you know somebody at that company that can help get your resume seen by the person. That's not gaming the system. It's just acknowledging connections, versus gaming the system would be, I'm going to write this thing on my resume that didn't really happen. Like
#1 Amazon bestseller.
Exactly. So I really like that. Is it portraying a story? Is it creating a story that changes the truth about what you have to offer? Or is it changing the story in a way that just creates opportunity? And that one, I feel slightly, I don't know, you can probably even hear it in my voice. I feel slightly less confident making that second statement because I can think of nuances in that I'm not okay with. It's like that one is even further nuanced. I don't know that we have to pick those apart, because there are versions of that just aren't okay. But what I think is important, the takeaway I have from this is that while there's this very clear, I'm not doing that version of that. Yeah. I have to be more careful about the other bucket. It deserves being sorted into multiple buckets, because if I make them all one bucket and it's all one no, I'm giving up opportunities that probably are actually worth looking at.
So my takeaway from that then is that...
Is your takeaway trying to battle my takeaway?
No, my takeaway is that when we discuss what, if anything, we're going to do about this blip advice you got, we're going to have to make sure that it's geared toward gaining better visibility for what we already do, but certainly not gaming the system.
Exactly.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village,
Yes, it does.
we'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.